So I'm a Drupal developer of about 8 years, and the other primary contributor on this project for Drupal 8 is my coworker Alex, and he's about 7 years Drupal developer as well. He's not here, obviously. Just shout out to him. So I thought it would be useful to look at some specific APIs that I had to work with moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So, I'm going to run through Entity API, Plugin API, the new Events Dispatching System, Queue API, building a REST client for a third-party API, and I'll look at root subscriber if we have time, which maybe. So first I'll start with a project overview of this module, just to give you some context of how things work if you're not familiar with Salesforce module. How many folks are module developers, module maintainers? How many people are familiar with Salesforce or this module?
Salesforce, not the module.
Okay, so just for context, I'm not going to get into this module or like what it does really, but you have entities in Drupal, and the module provides a mapping tool so you can relate fields or custom business logic from Drupal to Salesforce and vice versa, and synchronize your records back and forth. That's the 30,000 foot. And this is accomplished with several submodules, including mapping UI, and then push and pull modules that use the Drupal core Queue API, and then push and pull events that use the event dispatcher, and then this API client, which is it uses core APIs, but is primarily focused on implementing the Salesforce API within Drupal. So first of all, entity and entity storage. I think we still have node load, but you should not use that anymore. We have consolidated entity API. We have storage services, entity manager, and this is much more verbose, in general, but it's better for extensibility, dependability, and testability. And in order to take a look at some of the components that are in this API, I'll just dive right into code. We'll look at the annotations for some of the custom entities in Salesforce module. Hook schema is gone, so you have base field definitions now, and annotations provide what hook schema used to provide. Many of the things that used to be giant arrays are gone now, which is great. We have proper class hierarchy, proper object model, so this stuff just sort of makes a little more sense, and we get big pieces of functionality for free, or with very little effort. For example, a views integration, which I'll show here. So a mapped object in the Salesforce world is basically a join record between a Drupal entity and a Salesforce entity. So you have a Drupal ID on one side and a Salesforce ID on one side. The mapped object basically defines a table to link those two things together. So you can see my annotation here defines all the things that used to be in hook schema and more. So I have a custom storage class which overrides the base entity storage class. I have some extensions to the storage schema to define my own unique keys. I found the examples module to be super helpful to illustrate these annotations, and when that failed, I have a a copy of Drupal core open at all times, and Node. A lot of those annotations and APIs were written for these Drupal core concepts. So Node PHP has one of the most complete, if not the most complete, content entity type annotations. So I use this as an example, and there's pointers to all of the other helper classes and handlers that I used as well for examples. So
Can you increase the size of it?
no, I can't
Can
really.
you pull the projector back? Is it illegal? I mean, I'll move forward, but and I want to see it.
Well, I might be able to bump up this code size a little bit. Let's see.
Yeah.
Is that better? Yeah. This is the highest resolution I can be on for this projector. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to show an example of implementing, exposing this custom entity to views, which couldn't be much simpler. So right now here's an example of my custom entity. You can see my base fields are exposed here. I have my edit form. And if I want to create a view of this entity, right now, it's not available. Okay, so I'm going to look at node.php and see they're exposing a views data handler with this node views data class. And if we take a look at that, it extends entity views data. We can take a look at that class, and this is a proper class. It's not an abstract. So I'm going to use this in my custom class. All right, save that, clear my cache. And my revisions, as well as the core entity, is now available for views. And I wrote one line. I'll go ahead and create a page, and you can see that all of those all of the fields that I'm defining for this entity on base field definitions are also exposed. And Ted Bauman walked through this morning, so I'm not going to get too much into base field definitions. You can look at his slides for that. But you can see author, my entity references, Salesforce ID, the reference to the mapping, it's all here. And I can add those to the view just like anything else and make those easily available. So, super powerful stuff. Here's all those fields. So similar story for my mapping entity, except this is a config entity type. And the config entity is slightly different. I don't have a base fields. I have a schema YAML file to define what each instance of this config entity will look like. For this project, I had to give a lot of thought to, what is a content, what is config, and essentially config are things that make sense in the context of multiple environments, and content is specific to one environment. Config entity, I have my entity view builder, all my handlers are in here. Controllers for these links are exposed through my menus. And
Can I ask a question? Just so something I've never seen before. The lookup keys? Do you know what those are?
this is, these will add indexes, I think, for those fields. Is that right? No,
It's
actually,
got to be something like, I'm just glad
it's
to know
not,
something.
because
I can look it up too. I just never saw it, and I was wondering if you.
I don't remember offhand, in
It's fine.
fact.
It seems pretty powerful. It's got to be something.
Um, I think those. Yeah,
That's what it is. Okay.
it's just
Got it.
indexing, I guess.
Yeah, because if you're doing entity queries on static config files, it's slowest.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
cool.
So I'm loading these mapping configs frequently based on these properties. Yeah, I don't know where I found that in the first place.
Yeah, I just never
does
saw it. I
the-
looked at a lot of it together. That's why I don't want to distract you too much. I'm sorry.
No, sure. I mean, I'm all about questions. Yeah, and the so I have found the examples module falls short in a number of aspects. So it's good to get started with some of these APIs, but the core modules are much more robust, like I said. So, like views, for example, uses dozens and dozens of APIs and invents APIs. So let me keep going to plugin API. So previously, if you wanted to sort of craft your own API, it would look something like this. You would expose a hook that you called with module invoke all. You would maybe have another hook that expose some data from your modules and possibly another set of hooks with this naming convention and callback functions and magic methods, and all of this is sort of replaced with this plugin API, which is super powerful. Again, it's more concise, it's easier to read and document, extensible, dependable, testable, and I'll show you the example of the plugin manager for the Salesforce mapping field plugins. This is a super simple class that it sends a default plugin manager and implements a fallback manager plugin interface, which is a cool interface that I found from the blocks module. So I can define to implement this plugin manager interface, all I have to do is implement get fallback plugin ID, and then my fallback plugin, very similar to blocks, is just called broken. So if any of my mappings include a plugin that's now can't be found for whatever reason, this default is supplied, which just returns a message about this mapping being broken. So previously we had an extensive hook system where I had this Salesforce mapping field map type hook, and then the implementation would return this very extensive array with callbacks, and some things were optional, some things were hidden and undocumented. There's an options callback, and now all of that is encapsulated in my Salesforce mapping field plugin interface. So anything that wants to implement my plugin defines a plugin directory in the Salesforce mapping field subdirectory, and via the plugin annotation and implementation of this interface, or extending the base plugin, can easily tap into this plugin API. Let me back up to the interface, just defining the methods that I expect any implementation to expose, and then my manager calls each of these. Sorry, it's actually in the form. My manager is creating instances of the plugins and handing them around. Instead of module invoke all, I'm doing a much more concise get definitions, relying on core APIs to read the annotations, to handle caching, and it makes everything easier and better documented. Yeah, that's another good one. Any questions so far? So the Queue API is actually very similar in Drupal 8. The biggest difference is it's exposed to the plugin system now, as opposed to the hook system. Again, it makes for extensibility, dependability, testability, and in Drupal 8 we've implemented 2 different queues. Our pull queue uses the core queue API and the core DatabaseQueue to, during cron, pull Salesforce records and process them, update corresponding Drupal entities, or create new ones. We still have a cron hook because cron is not implemented as a service yet, really. So this queue handler just wrangles that process of getting those records from Salesforce and putting them into the database. My actual queue worker is this pull base plugin, and the meat of the queue API is this process item function method. If we look at queue worker base, too many projects open. This is an abstract, so we have to implement our own methods for all of the queue worker interface methods, which is just process item. So it's explained pretty well here, but essentially the core queue API assumes that your queue worker will process one item at a time. So, claim that item from queue, mark it as having been claimed, do some work on it, and either delete it from the queue or release it back into the queue to be worked on it more later by the same handler or by a different handler or anybody who wants to claim it. For our pull worker, that works fine because we are only pulling one item from Salesforce at a time. We're getting our mapping, loading any mapped objects, and creating an entity or updating an entity. Fine, no problem. That works pretty well. And from Drupal 7, this looked like we have these sort of magic methods based on our hook queue info. We have our worker callback here. So this array is gone. This is replaced by annotations in the plugin system. But the queue worker looks very similar, except we have a proper class now, and instead of 150 lines of code, it's divided up into methods that are testable, encapsulated, and much more readable. For our push queue, we have slightly different needs. The Salesforce API allows us to group and batch operations, so I can push 200 updates at a time from Drupal to Salesforce, which is 200 times more efficient in terms of API usage and network overhead. So the problem with Drupal core's queue API is there's no mechanism to do that. The major constraining assumption of the core queue system is that I'm working on one item at a time. But thanks to object orientation and a proper class system, now I can extend the database queue and override just those methods that I need to change that assumption completely. So in this class, I have overridden claim item, do create item, schema definition, and a few other things. So starting with schema definition, the core database queue does this cool thing where it has a schema definition function, which is a holdover from the previous hook schema, but it defines all of the fields for the core queue table. So by implementing my own schema definition I'm taking advantage of database queue's mechanism to create that table just in time. So I've not overridden this ensure table exists method, which does the actual work of creating the table. But since I overrode the schema, it will create my table, a new table, with all the properties that I need that are normalized instead of serialized. So the core database queue just dumps its queue items into a serialized column. So there's no way, for example, to group items by metadata. I need to be able to know Drupal entity type and Salesforce record type in order to make those batch operations efficient. So I have defined, entity ID, the name of the Salesforce mapping, and some other metadata so that I can group those together. So now when I do claim item, well, I don't do claim item because I'm doing multiple, right? So I'll throw an exception here just to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Instead, I've implemented a service, which is this push queue, and I'm calling that service on cron, just run process queues. And this is just lifted right from core cron or system cron that runs the same service on the core database queue. It looks nearly identical. So inside process queues, I'm doing all my logic to gather mappings, figure out what needs to run, and instead of calling claim item, I'm calling claim items and handing that off to my queue processor plugin. So this is actually another instance of a new plugin API, an additional plugin API. Right now I have exactly one implementation based on the REST API. But the idea here is specifically to be able to plug in a SOAP API client that will take advantage of those batchable API operations. And inside of here, I receive an array of items instead of just a single item. So the core queue worker plugin uses process item just the same. In this case, it's a protected function because I actually want to call process with an array of items. So I'm actually not using the core Queue Worker API for that. So I am using an extension of the database queue. So again, this was basically not possible in Drupal 7. I would have had to implement my own Queue API from scratch. And I wouldn't have had any pluggability in terms of Queue Worker, and I wouldn't have gotten any reuse out of Drupal's core database queue because it was not extensible. Good, so that's Queue API. Events API. So in Drupal 7, we have module invoke all, or Drupal alter, or for each module implements, name of my hook, module invoke to implement our APIs. Now, nearly all of the hooks in Salesforce module I was able to replace using the event dispatcher service. And then, again, this is using the plugin system. I don't think I have any actual implementations of those events, but the way that looks like as a framework. First of all, I have this static final class Salesforce events, which essentially takes the place of my API.php document to explain what are all the events that are going to come from this module. What can you subscribe to? Excuse me. And this pattern I copied from various core events documentation. So, for example, config events. It defines a constant, which is the name of the event, and then explains what the listeners should look for if they're implementing that listener. So, for example, do I have examples in this module? I do have an example. I have an event subscriber which subscribes to this push params alter event, again by referencing my static class here and the event name. So if that changes, that will be I won't have to update all my implementations. And then this points to a method on the class push params alter, which accepts this push event as described as out of date in this API here. So my Salesforce push event, when I instantiate this, has all of the objects that I need that previously I would be passing by reference to an anonymous function, are proper objects here. So, for example, when I'm dispatching an event, it looks sort of like this. So here's my Drupal service inside of a class that would look more like well, I should be using a dependency injection here. So I'm dispatching the name of the event, which again, a reference to that static, and then creating a new event object, which again I have defined on my own API and has everything I need in there. So a listener can manipulate any of these objects. This can be used not only as just sort of a notify, log this event, notify, do something else. I can also actually manipulate these objects that are passed by this event. So it works to take the place of an alter as well, and not just hey, this thing is happening. It's an opportunity for those listeners to throw an exception, to stop execution if they want to do that. And I think this documentation is still slightly out of date. Let me switch to. So right. So where I want a listener to throw an exception to stop execution, I'm just documenting that in my Salesforce events. Conceivably, I could implement a listener interface, or I could implement a specific event, and with annotations that say whether or not it will throw an event. Throw an exception, excuse me. So wherever possible, I have switched over to using those listeners rather than the old hook system. And again,
Still?
I have eliminated all of them.
You've got all 100% of this stuff.
Yeah, which I'm not sure if that's the best solution at this point, but there hasn't been a use case where I need a hook and should have, or right, I'm implementing an event and should have had a hook yet.
Yeah, no, I think the hook system is good for people who are just not technical. You know, like where they can't wrap their head around the event subscribe and creating that class and wrapping their...
Yeah, so, I mean, practically, with this module, whenever we've deployed it for our clients, what ends up happening is I make a module called client_SF that implements 50 Salesforce hooks. So, practically, I'll just do that in one subscriber now, and everything will be testable, will be readable and encapsulated a lot better.
and it gets the hooks out of that main.module file.
Exactly, and then I don't even need a module file in some cases.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, and then I can have superclassing, subclassing, which will actually help us as a firm for scalability. If I want to extend, if I want to package up some features that I'm using all the time, I don't have to hack that module for the next client or copy and paste it in and just inherit that class. So I mean, I'll be honest. I've refactored things 5 or 6 times, changing architectural decisions while developing this module. So I'm not sure. We may end up going back to some hooks.
You can have them in late.
But you could also use both. You could have you could call out to a hook as well as throw off an event. Dispatch an event, right, and reconcile the return values from those to have them function
If
equivalently.
someone really wanted to, they can create the Salesforce hook module and take all your event subscribers and just put a hook in there.
Right, and just call module invoke,
Yeah.
module invoke all when they receive that event. Yeah, and I think I read about somebody kicking around that idea to get Drupal core into fully event-based.
The backwards compatibility.
Yeah, but preserving backwards compatibility for 8.
Yeah.
And I know in Drupal, I'm pretty sure in Drupal 9 there will no longer be hooks. There will only be events. And so in developing this module, we are working for 9, even if we're taking shortcuts not shortcuts, but we're using deprecated methods and APIs in the short term. We're trying to get rid of those. And whenever things have sort of stabilized in the Drupal core world, we're jumping on those, recommended practices. So Entity Manager was phased out for 6 different services in the past year or 2. And we have also, started using Entity Type Manager and the various new services for those, so that the next time we have to make a major update of this module, it's not going to be, this huge endeavor. Hopefully, it will sort of be better maintained moving forward. With those in mind, so the next thing is this Salesforce REST API client, which is implemented as a custom service in Drupal 8. In Drupal 7, this was encapsulated in a class, but that class contains, or that file contains 3 different classes, and the class name doesn't match, and there's no name spacing. And the only way to get to this class is to call a procedural function which instantiates a new instance, which returns a new instance of it. So in Drupal 8, we were able to implement that as a service instead. So that's just a services YAML in your module file, a pointer to the class, and all of the dependency injections that you need. And this also allowed us to use this service for other services we implemented and to inject our own dependencies. I think it's taken me a full 3 years to sort of fully wrap my head around dependency injections, but it's super cool now, now that I sort of understand it. And I'm not talking a ton about testing because my colleague Alex has mostly been working on that. But from his experience and the exposure that I have had to it, dependency injection makes like proper unit testing just so much easier. So again, this is just implemented as a service. Not extending anything at this point, but I'm relying on various Drupal core services. The one thing that I have found is, are we even doing it here? Well, I don't think we're doing it here because we have dependency injection, but for situations when dependency injection is not available, for example, on a form callback, I don't think we have, and we do on a form callback. Okay, I'll come back to that if I remember what I'm trying to say here. So the fact that this was encapsulated into a class made this a lot easier to port to Drupal 8. I basically just had to update any of the instances where I was using Drupal APIs, and the rest sort of just came together. The improvements that I was able to make were around standardizing things like exceptions that were thrown from this module, standardizing responses from the Salesforce API. So, I know now I can, like for this method, for example, I can guarantee that it will return a certain class or it will throw an exception. And this sort of relates back to one of Larry Garfield's talks from a DrupalCon, where he talks about making developers happy, and things like type hinting and guaranteeing return classes go a long way towards that. So this is actually the beginnings of sort of a PHP SDK for the Salesforce REST API. It's got a long way to go, I think, but we have a REST response which wraps up the Guzzle core response in so everything from the REST API is a JSON string, and this wrapper just parses that JSON string or throws an exception if it can't be parsed. So that actually allowed us to get rid of a lot of the error handling from the REST client itself. Now we know either the response gives us a proper object, or it throws an exception and we let that bubble up to whoever invoked that method. So that was cool. Are we using traits on here? No. Okay. Did I miss anything? Type hinting, yeah. Look through that. So anyway, I'll just run through some takeaways from my experience. The learning curve is greater, and the barrier to entry for Drupal, for people coming from Drupal 7 is definitely greater. But once you get over that hurdle, the barrier to implementing new APIs or to implementing Drupal core APIs or those barriers are a lot lower. So I'm extending classes now rather than copying and pasting large chunks of code and rewriting them. For example, with a menu alter hook or with a form alter. The plugin API makes creating your own APIs much simpler. Annotations reduce overhead and take care of a lot of the things that we had to do in a very hard and tedious way in Drupal 7. Drupal 8 is finally object-oriented. There's still plenty of procedural stuff, but we can call methods now on objects, which is great. I can reliably use a node class. I can read the documentation for a class. I can look at an object and not have to also have a string telling me what kind of object that instance is. So I was saying to somebody at lunch, I feel like an actual developer or a software engineer now, and not a Drupal programmer. So that has been a great experience. And the documentation is, I think it's part and parcel with moving to an object-oriented framework. The documentation is so much better. There's more of it, and there are more files, and there's lots of more places to look, but it is more robust, and it's reliable now because we've been forced to become reliable. So as I was talking about earlier, we've had so many refactors. Your architecture decisions are important, especially early on. You probably end up changing stuff, even if everything is carefully considered. If you're like me and sort of, designing things as you work. Naming things is really hard, and like sometimes you have overlap now. So, for example, in Drupal core, there's like at least 3 classes called plugin.php.
Yeah.
And there's examples like that all over. So namespacing is a blessing on one hand, that you don't have to have these horribly long class and function names, but it also makes things a little trickier to navigate. And we're paying the price now for not having written tests for all this stuff. We've developed this huge stack of code, and now we're trying to write tests on top of it, and that is forcing us to refactor lots of things in that code to make them testable or make them more easily testable. So I'm sort of appreciating the value of test-driven development, and dependency injection and encapsulation, and sort of breaking things down to their most simple constituent parts. And I think looking for examples of how to do that in core is the best source of knowledge. The community and Stack Overflow and those resources are catching up, but core is on the front line, and especially like the latest dev master of core, rather than like 8.2 or 8.3. We're developing towards 8.4 now. So again, navigating and learning all this stuff can be tedious. I always keep a copy of Drupal core open, and specifically core services, because this is one place where documentation fails. Like, this service is named main content renderer.html. If I'm looking at this HTML render class, I have no way to know that. This core services YAML is the only thing that links the service to the actual provider of that service.
Can you file an issue for that one? You're spot on. Like they need to literally say these are the class. These are this class has this service definition.
Well, and it
here's
should
the
be
class.
easy to do to
Yeah.
generate it from this YAML.
It should be on every single. That class should have that code at the top of it, so that you're not.
Right, and like that should be in like the CI builder
Yeah.
for Drupal core. And it's not consistent whether it's even called a service in the class.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that like things are pluggable, but is anybody providing their own accept negotiation 406 service? Probably not. Has anybody ever seen a 406 HTTP response? I have not. So core services, always keep that open. I am not using PHP Storm, as you probably have noticed, but I'm pretty quick myself with TextMate, and I have Dash is a super cool tool. So in that links into TextMate, I have a hotkey for that would just look up in Drupal.org documentation. I'm using Mac GDBP is a visual debugger, a step-through debugger, because I don't have it in my IDE. But PHP Storm offers a step-through debugger. That's been crucial for me because using DPM to print out these objects crashes my browser. So the step-through, you have to see what's happening a little more specifically. There are a couple hidden flags for. I think I stopped using Kint and I'm using var dumper now for my devel output because Kint was freezing all the time and var dumper had more sensible defaults, so I didn't have to worry about that on new sites. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say besides like it's a slog to try and develop your mental model of all this documentation and figure out how to navigate everything. Use the examples module, use core examples. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Would your slides be available on GitHub by any chance?
They are. I don't know if it's the most up-to-date version.
Any of your KPIs? Oh, there.
The presentation is in here, and you can view it on GitHub.io. I just started trying to put together this page, so this is my first time using GitHub.io, but they're public here. I can link that to the session on DrupalCamp here.
So the code that you were showing, is that anywhere?
Oh yeah, sorry. That's the Salesforce module. That's project/Salesforce on Drupal.org. You can contact me from this page. You can complain about the code in the issue queue here. And we are actively working on Drupal 8. We expect to have a beta up on Drupal.org in the next month or so. And I'll be around the rest of the day if anybody wants to ask me questions about this or like specific Salesforce stuff. I'm happy to talk about too.
There's one part where in the initial first part, when you're getting information from Salesforce, you're doing one event at a time or one article, one thing at a time. But when you're pushing it to Salesforce, you're doing it 200 at a time.
Not exactly. So the pull operation is divided into two parts. The first part is querying Salesforce for updated entities, and that's a bulk operation. So I issue my query to the Salesforce API and say, for example, show me any contacts that have been updated since the last cron run, in the last hour, let's say. And then I get all of those results and I stash them in the queue table, and that's all serialized. So the entire object that I received from that query just gets dumped into the queue table.
Right.
And then the second part is the queue worker. So that's my queue handler that runs on cron.
Okay.
And then the system core cron, I can show you that actually,
That's one at a time?
processes anything in the queue table one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the core database cron service.
How slow, what's the effect? Is it slow or is it fast if you're doing one at a time? Have you measured that?
No, and it depends on your entity. I mean, basically, you're doing an entity save every time for each of those items, so that's slow. And if you have complex entities and entity references, it's even slower. And if you have entity hooks that have cascading entity saves, it can be slow, which is why it needs to be asynchronous and queued like that.
Yeah, did you open up some, so you have the queue set up and you're using cron. Have you opened up other APIs, like the drush command to do a batch I'm fascinated by what you did with cron, because I'm guilty of putting too much business logic in cron, and then you're stuck with cron. You've got the business logic in the queue module, so then you could open up other APIs. So you could have a drush command do batch processing.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
UI do batch processing.
Exactly. So I think with our custom queue, we probably break most of those. But with the pull queue, since we're using the core queue API, like there's a module that will expose all your queues,
okay.
right? There's a queue UI module. There's drush commands
Drush has a queue.
that overview your queues.
Somehow avoided queues, and I'm seeing the potential. So drush has a queue command where you can run through it.
Drush has queue commands. There's a queue UI module. The batch API uses queues, uses a queue API to run its operations. We like for this update, we took the same tack as Drupal, and just tried to use as many core APIs as possible.
Yeah, it shows. It's really clear you've lined up with all the stuff that's going on in core here.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an endeavor for sure.
And the testing. So, are you using Drupal.org's test bot, or that's like with the continuous integration?
We're just starting. I think we have a branch open now to try and get, we started writing tests, but they weren't structured correctly for a test bot to pick them up.
Yeah.
So we have a branch now that's restructuring and getting them to run. That's going to go up on Drupal.org to go and get tested.
I know Neil Drum is on the Drupal Association, and they've got that test bot going so fast.
Yeah, I noticed that too. When it first went up, it was like I might wait a week for my test to run, and now it's like 5 minutes later.
And when they run, I'm seeing it like 40 times faster than my local machine. Literally, it takes 30 minutes to run the test suite on Drupal.org.
Yeah.
It's 3 minutes. It's crazy.
Yeah, and since they're using PHP unit now, you can run, I don't have any history here, but you can run like individual tests, you can run a class, you can run tests by group. So, I mean, previously for using simple tests, I found it very onerous to just get set up to run the tests locally. There were a lot of hurdles to that, and now it's all, if you have a local Drupal install, you can run tests with no trouble.
You're lucky in the sense of that now Drupal's on PHP unit. You don't need to write any more Drupal tests. Everything's been ported over to PHP unit, and there's just
and we had
legacy.
some in Drupal 7, but it was really just testing the admin UI, like none of the actual none of the meat of the module, like the push and pull, were testable really, without creating this huge framework for mocking the Salesforce endpoint.
You just said mocking. I thought one of your takeaways is an important thing that you didn't mention. I think it's critical for testing is interfaces, because for mocking you need the interface. To do mocking right, you want the interface and not a class. And it's the mistake I've made where I had to go back in and create interfaces for everything.
We're facing that a little bit, and this is again I think there's a way to do it where you actually write the interfaces first, right? Like if you have the ability to architect out your whole solution, you can just start by writing the interfaces, and then not only do you have right? You can break the project apart so easily. You can hand an interface to somebody and say, build this out. You can hand it to someone else and say, build tests for this.
That
We
hasn't
haven't-
been
we
addressed
didn't
in
do that.
People have not like done a session and really got into that. Where that's possible, large teams could break down Drupal into these
Sure. Yeah.
classes.
And yeah, you're right. We're paying for that now. A little bit. Like I threw in some interfaces just so that I would have a thing called an interface, but figure out what's supposed to be in this interface. Like we don't have proper interface definitions yet for everything, which is one of those things. Like I said, we're writing tests now and figuring out that we're gonna need those.
PageStorm has a nice refactoring where you can take the object, you can push the document definition out of the object into the interface.
Into an interface?
You can,
Oh, that's
you
cool.
can generate and push. Like you could take what you have here that's extending mapped object interface, and you can go in and right click and say, okay, push these methods, and check them off, and then take the documentation up. It doesn't put the inherit.
Oh, that would be cool.
It doesn't put inherit doc in because people don't understand that.
Right.
But it does copy.
Right.
And it does help.
Okay.
I had to do dozens of interfaces.
Yeah. Oh, here's an example that I was looking for before.
Yeah.
Rather than referring to the service like throughout my code like this, I have this client method wherever I need it. So again, for testing, I can just mock that client method.
Yeah, you see that in core a lot. I didn't really get that. Like even
Yeah.
on the form builder, you see a lot of they have that for a lot of the common services that aren't injected.
Right, because entities aren't injected. They go through a storage factory.
What is the name of that pattern?
Um,
It's like a weird one.
I don't know.
It's a variation of dependency injection.
It's like a service wrapper or something.
Yeah, wrapper for the service. Okay.
But yeah. Any other questions or feedback, comments?
Thank you.
Okay.